James II of Scotland lost his kingdom because a servant squeezed a pimple on his face with unwashed hands. The infection damaged his facial nerve, causing his face to twist into uncontrollable grimaces during diplomatic meetings. Foreign ambassadors interpreted these spasms as deliberate insults, alliances collapsed, and Scotland descended into chaos because no one could trust what the king's face was telling them. James II ruled Scotland during a period when the kingdom was constantly dealing with English aggression from the south and internal clan conflicts. His power depended on his ability to negotiate with nobles, maintain diplomatic relationships with European powers, and project authority during public ceremonies. In medieval politics, a king's facial expressions carried enormous weight because they communicated approval, threat, or neutrality without words. A slight change in expression during a negotiation could signal agreement or rejection, and experienced diplomats watched a monarch's face constantly to understand his true intentions. The problem started after James returned from a 3-day trip inspecting military fortifications along the border. The journey involved long hours in the saddle wearing full armor, which meant sweat and dust accumulated under the metal plates pressed against his skin. When he took off the armor back at Edinburgh Castle, he noticed a small inflamed pimple on his right cheek. This was a normal skin irritation caused by the friction and dirt, nothing that seemed concerning. The pimple was slightly red and raised, but James ignored it completely and went to sleep. The next morning, he had a scheduled reception with a trade delegation from Burgundy. These meetings were important for Scotland's economic relationships with continental Europe, so James needed to look presentable. His personal servant walked into the chamber to help him prepare and immediately saw the pimple on the king's cheek. The servant decided to fix this problem quickly. Without washing his hands and without asking permission, he pressed his fingers against the king's face and squeezed the pimple hard, trying to make it disappear before the meeting. The pimple ruptured under the pressure. The servant's hands were covered in dirt and bacteria from his morning work around the castle, handling firewood and equipment in the stables. When the inflamed tissue burst, the bacteria from his unwashed fingers entered directly into the wound. Then the servant made it worse. He grabbed the edge of his own sleeve to wipe the king's face clean. This sleeve had been worn for several days without washing and was filthy with accumulated dirt, food stains, and other contamination. He pressed this dirty fabric against the open wound, pushing more bacteria deep into the tissue beneath the skin. What made this dangerous was the location. The facial nerve runs beneath the skin of the cheek, protected by layers of muscle and connective tissue. This nerve controls all the muscles on one side of the face, allowing a person to smile, frown, close their eye, and make every other facial expression. When the bacteria from the servant's hands and sleeve penetrated through the broken skin, they reached the area around this nerve and began multiplying. The body's immune response created inflammation and swelling in the tissue, and this swelling started pressing against the nerve branches. James went to the Burgundian reception that same day with just a small red mark on his cheek. The meeting went normally, the trade agreements were discussed, and nobody noticed anything wrong. But under the surface, the infection was spreading deeper into the tissue around the facial nerve. The bacteria continued multiplying, the inflammation increased, and the pressure on the nerve grew stronger. For the first 2 days, James only felt some tenderness in his cheek and assumed it was healing. He attended his regular council meetings and handled normal government business without any problems. On the 3rd night, he woke up feeling a strange tingling sensation in his cheek, like small electrical pulses under the skin. He touched his face but everything felt normal on the outside, so he dismissed it and went back to sleep. The tingling was actually the first sign that the infection had reached the main branch of the facial nerve and was beginning to disrupt the signals traveling from his brain to his facial muscles. On the 4th morning, James experienced the first visible symptom while getting dressed for a council session. He was standing in front of a mirror when the corner of his mouth suddenly twitched on its own. It was a small movement, just a brief flutter of the muscle, but it happened without him willing it. He tried to control his face consciously, and for a moment everything seemed normal. Then it twitched again. This was the facial nerve misfiring because the inflammation around it was interfering with the normal electrical signals. The infection had created swelling in the tissue that surrounded the nerve, and this pressure was causing the nerve to send random signals to the facial muscles. Think of it like a wire with damaged insulation that occasionally sends electrical pulses at the wrong times. The muscles would contract briefly without James intending them to move. At first, these spasms were minor and infrequent. A twitch at the corner of the mouth, a slight flutter of the cheek muscle. James thought he was just tired from the recent travel and stress of government work. Over the next few days, the spasms became more noticeable and more frequent. During a meeting with his financial advisors, his cheek would suddenly jerk, pulling one side of his mouth upward for a second before relaxing. The advisors noticed but said nothing, assuming the king had developed a nervous tic from stress. Then the spasms started happening at night. James would wake up feeling his facial muscles twitching and contracting on their own, sometimes for several minutes at a time. His eye would squeeze shut involuntarily, or his mouth would pull to one side without him controlling it. The real problem emerged about a week after the original injury. The inflammation around the facial nerve had grown more severe, and now the nerve was not just misfiring occasionally but was being compressed constantly by the swollen tissue. This compression caused longer and stronger muscle contractions. James was in his private chambers reviewing documents when he felt a strange sensation in his face, and suddenly the entire right side of his face pulled tight. His eye closed, his mouth twisted upward into what looked like a sneer, and his cheek muscles contracted hard. The expression froze on his face for almost a full minute while he sat there unable to control it. When it finally released, he could move his face normally again, but he was deeply disturbed by what had just happened. These episodes of frozen grimaces became the defining feature of his condition. The damaged facial nerve would send sustained signals to multiple muscle groups at once, locking them into contorted positions that James could not override with conscious effort. Sometimes his face would twist into an expression that looked like an angry scowl. Other times it would pull into something resembling a mocking smile or a sneer. The worst part was the unpredictability. He never knew when his face would suddenly contort, how long it would stay frozen, or what expression it would form. The infection had essentially destroyed his ability to control his own facial expressions, and in a world where a king's face was constantly being watched and interpreted, this was a catastrophic disability. The medical understanding of the time was completely inadequate to deal with this problem. The royal physicians examined James and had no explanation for why his face was behaving this way. They tried various treatments based on medieval medical theory, including bloodletting and applying poultices to the affected area, but nothing helped because they did not understand that a bacterial infection was destroying the nerve tissue. The inflammation continued to worsen, the nerve damage became more severe, and the facial spasms grew stronger and more frequent. James was losing control of the one thing a medieval monarch absolutely needed to maintain power, the ability to communicate his intentions through his facial expressions. The facial spasms destroyed James's ability to conduct diplomacy, and the first major disaster occurred during negotiations with an English delegation sent to discuss border disputes. These talks were critically important because Scotland and England had been in a state of periodic conflict for decades, and this meeting represented a chance to establish a more stable peace. James sat across from the English ambassadors in the Great Hall, flanked by his Scottish advisors, prepared to discuss territorial agreements and trade terms. He began speaking about the proposal for a neutral zone along the border, explaining Scotland's position in calm, measured language. Then, in the middle of his sentence, his face suddenly twisted. The right side of his mouth pulled upward sharply, his eye partially closed, and his cheek muscles contracted into what appeared to be a contemptuous sneer. The expression locked onto his face and stayed there while he continued speaking. The English ambassadors stopped listening to his words and stared at his face. To them, it looked like the King of Scotland was openly mocking their proposals while pretending to negotiate seriously. They interpreted the sneer as a deliberate insult, a signal that James had no real intention of reaching an agreement and was simply toying with them. One of the senior English diplomats stood up abruptly and stated that his delegation would not continue discussions with a monarch who showed such disrespect. They left the hall, and the negotiations collapsed completely. James tried to explain that the facial expression was involuntary, that he had no control over it, but this explanation made things worse. The English ambassadors reported back to their king that James II appeared to be either mentally unstable or playing some kind of elaborate deceptive game, and either way, he could not be trusted as a negotiating partner. The failure of these talks meant the border conflicts would continue, trade relationships remained strained, and the possibility of a stable peace disappeared. But this was just the beginning of the diplomatic damage. A few weeks later, a delegation from France arrived to discuss a potential military alliance against England. This alliance was enormously important for Scotland's security because French support provided a counterbalance to English military power. James understood the stakes and prepared carefully for these meetings, knowing that Scotland's independence might depend on securing French backing. The negotiations began well, with both sides expressing interest in formalizing their cooperation. Then James's face betrayed him again. The French ambassador was explaining the terms his king proposed for the alliance when James's facial nerve triggered another sustained spasm. This time, his entire right side pulled into an expression that looked like barely suppressed laughter, as if he found the French proposals ridiculous and was struggling not to laugh out loud. The ambassador stopped mid-sentence and stared at the Scottish king. James continued nodding and responding seriously to the proposals, but his face told a completely different story. To the French delegation, it appeared that James was secretly mocking their offers while pretending to take them seriously. The ambassador concluded the meeting politely but coldly. In his report back to the French court, he described James II as duplicitous and possibly unstable, someone whose words could not be trusted because his facial expressions revealed contempt and mockery that contradicted his spoken agreements. The French king decided that an alliance with such an unpredictable partner was too risky, and Scotland lost its most important potential ally against England. James tried to send follow-up messages explaining his medical condition, but these were dismissed as elaborate excuses. The reputation damage was done, and other European courts began hearing reports that the King of Scotland could not be trusted because his face revealed hidden hostility and deception during negotiations. The pattern repeated itself over the following months with delegations from Burgundy, the German states, and smaller European powers. Each time, James would attempt to conduct serious diplomatic business, and each time his facial spasms would create expressions that contradicted his words. Ambassadors interpreted these involuntary grimaces as deliberate signals revealing the king's true contemptuous attitudes. Scotland's diplomatic isolation grew worse with each failed negotiation. Foreign courts stopped sending high-level delegations because they concluded that James II was either playing mind games or was mentally unfit to govern, and in either case, agreements with him were worthless. The infection in his facial nerve had effectively ended Scotland's ability to conduct foreign policy. The facial spasms did not just destroy Scotland's external relationships but also collapsed the internal functioning of the government. Medieval monarchy depended heavily on the king's ability to communicate approval or displeasure through facial expressions during council meetings. When a minister presented a proposal, the king's expression while listening told everyone in the room whether the idea had merit or should be abandoned. A slight frown could kill a proposal before discussion even began. A neutral expression encouraged debate. A hint of a smile signaled approval. This system of nonverbal communication was essential for efficient governance, and James's damaged facial nerve made it completely unreliable. The problem became apparent during a council meeting when the treasurer presented the annual revenue report. The numbers showed a significant shortfall in tax collection from the Highland clans, a politically sensitive issue that required careful handling. As the treasurer explained the situation, James's face suddenly twisted into what looked like an expression of rage. His jaw clenched, his mouth pulled into a tight grimace, and his eye narrowed in what appeared to be fury. The treasurer stopped speaking immediately, assuming he had somehow deeply offended the king. The other ministers exchanged worried glances, trying to understand what had provoked such anger. James was actually listening calmly and had no emotional reaction to the report at all. His face was simply misfiring again, locking into a grimace that had nothing to do with his actual thoughts. He tried to speak normally and reassure the treasurer that everything was fine, but his frozen facial expression contradicted his words so dramatically that nobody believed him. The treasurer concluded the report quickly and nervously, and the ministers began discussing ways to address what they assumed was the king's anger about Highland tax collection, even though James had never indicated any such concern. Policies were modified based on a facial expression that meant nothing. This pattern destroyed effective governance over the following months. Ministers began interpreting James's involuntary facial spasms as secret signals about his real opinions. When his face twisted during a discussion about military spending, the council assumed he opposed the proposed budget and reduced it significantly, even though James actually supported the full amount. When his face pulled into what looked like a smile during a report about clan violence in the north, ministers thought he approved of harsh punishments and authorized brutal crackdowns that James never intended. The government was making major policy decisions based on random nerve misfires instead of the king's actual judgment. The situation grew even worse when court factions began deliberately misinterpreting James's facial spasms to advance their own agendas. If a minister wanted to block a rival's proposal, he would wait until James's face happened to twist during the discussion and then claim the king's expression showed clear opposition. If another faction wanted to push through a controversial policy, they would point to an involuntary grimace as evidence of royal support. James tried repeatedly to clarify that his facial expressions were meaningless, but this created a different problem. If the king's face could not be trusted, then how could anyone know what he actually thought about anything? The fundamental mechanism of medieval royal communication had broken down completely. The chaos extended beyond the council chamber into the broader Scottish nobility. Clan chiefs and regional lords who came to the royal court for audiences with the king left confused and angry because they could not read his intentions. A lord might request military support against a rival clan and interpret James's involuntary sneer as mockery of the request, leading to a breakdown in the relationship. Another might present a proposal for a marriage alliance and see the king's face twist into what looked like disgust, even though James was actually considering the proposal seriously. These misunderstandings accumulated into a broader crisis of confidence in the monarchy. The Scottish nobility began to believe that James was either playing incomprehensible political games or was mentally unstable, and either way, he could no longer be relied upon to govern effectively. The end of James's effective rule came during a critical negotiation with a Norwegian delegation in late 1460. Norway controlled territories in the Northern Islands that Scotland wanted to acquire, and these negotiations represented years of diplomatic preparation. The Norwegian king had sent senior representatives with authority to finalize a territorial agreement that would significantly expand Scottish control in the north. This was the most important diplomatic achievement James had worked toward during his reign, and success would have strengthened Scotland's position considerably. Everything depended on this final meeting where the terms would be formally agreed upon and the treaty signed. James entered the negotiating chamber knowing exactly what needed to happen. The Scottish position was clear, the Norwegian offers had been carefully evaluated, and both sides had reason to want an agreement. He began the meeting by formally welcoming the Norwegian delegation and expressing his respect for their king. The Norwegians responded with equal courtesy. Then James began speaking the crucial sentence that would finalize the territorial terms. He got halfway through the sentence when his facial nerve triggered the most severe spasm he had experienced yet. His entire right side convulsed. The muscles pulled so hard that his mouth twisted into an extreme grimace that looked like a vicious, mocking smile. His eyes squeezed almost completely shut. His cheek muscles contracted visibly under the skin. and the expression locked there, frozen on his face while he tried to continue speaking the important diplomatic language. To the Norwegian delegates, it appeared that the King of Scotland was grinning like a predator in the middle of offering what was supposed to be a respectful territorial agreement. They interpreted it as a deliberate and extreme insult, suggesting that James viewed them as fools who were being tricked into a disadvantageous deal. The senior Norwegian diplomat stood up immediately. He stated formally that his delegation would not continue negotiations with a monarch who showed such open contempt and mockery. The Norwegians walked out of the chamber, left Edinburgh within hours, and reported back to their king that James II was either mad or deliberately hostile. The Norwegian court broke off all diplomatic contact with Scotland, and the territorial agreement that would have expanded Scottish power collapsed completely. James tried to send envoys to explain his medical condition, but the Norwegians refused to receive them. The damage was final. This failure broke something fundamental in James's authority. The Scottish nobility watched their king lose a critical diplomatic achievement because his face had betrayed him at the worst possible moment, and they concluded that he was simply incapable of fulfilling his basic responsibilities as monarch. Regional lords stopped seeking royal approval for their decisions because they could not trust what James's expressions meant. Court factions began operating independently, making policy without consulting the king because his input had become worse than useless. Foreign powers stopped sending diplomatic missions entirely because James's reputation had spread throughout Europe as a king whose face could not be trusted. James II continued living for some time after this, but his actual power was effectively finished. The Scottish government fragmented into competing regional authorities. Clan violence increased because there was no credible central authority to mediate disputes. England took advantage of the chaos by increasing military pressure on the border. Scotland's diplomatic isolation became complete as European courts simply stopped considering the kingdom a reliable partner. The entire structure of Scottish royal authority collapsed not because of military defeat or political conspiracy, but because a bacterial infection had destroyed one man's ability to control his facial expressions, and in medieval politics, that loss was fatal. The historical record shows that James II died in 1460 during a military campaign when a cannon exploded near him, but by that point his reign had already effectively ended. The real destruction of his rule happened in the months after a servant squeezed a pimple with dirty hands, when the resulting nerve damage made it impossible for anyone to trust what the king's face was telling them. Scotland descended into chaos because the fundamental mechanism of medieval royal communication, the king's facial expressions, had been destroyed by an infection that spread from a simple wound into the tissue surrounding the facial nerve. Everything collapsed because nobody could read the intentions of a monarch whose face no longer belonged to him.